Hello and welcome. My name is Carla Golden, and this presentation is titled The Paterno Family, Chronicling a New York Real Estate Legacy. This is what we'll be looking at together during this video from the southernmost point of 35th Street up to 188th Street, between Riverside Drive to the west and East End Avenue to the east. We're going to look at a total of 164 buildings, of which only 14 have been demolished. Of those 164, 155 are apartment houses, 4 are family homes, 1 a castle, 1 a garage, 1 a theater, 1 cultural center, and 1 tiny steel house. The most amazing piece of this story is that this building legacy was largely an accidental situation. No one in the Paterno family set out to create a building empire in Manhattan. Okay, let's start at the beginning. But first, you might be asking yourself, who is Carla and what gives her any authority to speak about the Paterno family? The people in black and white are the Paterno family members who you will meet. Third from the left is Charles Paterno, my great-grandfather. He had 1 child, a son, my grandfather, Carlo. Carlo had 3 daughters, of which 1 is my mother. I was born in Manhattan, but my time as a New Yorker was very short, as my family relocated to Asheville, North Carolina, by the time I was 2 years old. I'm coming to you from South Carolina, where I now live. Over the years, I heard tidbits about my great-grandfather and his assorted buildings around Manhattan. But it wasn't until the pandemic in 2020 did I devote any significant time to digging into my family history. As I was researching my genealogy, I read a statement that claimed it was, quote, estimated that the Paterno family built over 100 buildings in Manhattan, unquote. That sounded just like the temptation my sort of curiosity feasted on, so I set out to find these 100 buildings. As you now know, I have positively identified 164 Manhattan buildings, 155 being apartment buildings, constructed by the Paterno family. As far as I know, my research is the first time in history that all the Paterno buildings in Manhattan have ever been cataloged in one place. Now back to the beginning. The family consists of 2 parents and their 10 children, 5 brothers and 5 sisters, sisters who will bring 5 brothers-in-law into the family. The family originated in the town of Castelmezzano in the province of Potenza, in the region of Basilicata in southern Italy, right where the red pin is on the map. The small village of Castelmezzano is nestled in the Dolomiti Lucane mountain range in the valley of Bicento. This photo is of modern Castelmezzano lit up at dusk. It is 13 square miles, and in 2019, it had a population of 771 people, which is almost half of the population it had in 1975. Around 1900, when the Paterno family left Castelmezzano, there were approximately 2,100 residents. Giovanni was born in Castelmezzano in 1851 as the oldest of 7 children. Giovanni married Maria Carolina Trevino in 1872. While Carolina was pregnant with their 4th child, Giovanni immigrated to America. Giovanni was a builder in Castelmezzano, and due to an accidental collapse at his construction job that nearly destroyed him, he left southern Italy in 1880 at 29 years old, filled with desperation to redeem himself, recover his pride, restore his professional reputation, and rebuild his finances. Once in the New World, he Americanized his name to John Paterno. Giovanni's wife, Carolina, was born in Castelmezzano in 1853 as the seventh of 12 children. 5 years after renting a room in Lower Manhattan and working relentlessly as a laborer and eventually as a foreman, husband and father, John Paterno, paid off his hometown debts, saved for travel expenses, and called for his family to join him. Carolina and her 4 children left the port of Naples, Italy, in December of 1884 and sailed for 31 days to reach the Castle Garden immigration station in New York City. Eldest child Celestina was 11 years old. Severio, whose name was Americanized to Frank, was 8. Canio, who became Charles, was 6. And Giuseppe, now Joseph, was almost 4 years old. The family settled at 220 Mott Street between Spring and Prince Streets in Lower Manhattan. It is circled in red on the pink map. Note that Grammar School number 5 is located right next door. The Paterno family grew as Manhattan developed. By the time their 5th child, Marie, arrived, the Brooklyn Bridge was in full commission, and the new Statue of Liberty was standing tall in the New York harbor. 6th child, Michael, was born the same year as the Great Blizzard of 1888. Also that year, Charles was noted in the newspaper as being a bright scholar at Grammar School number 5, the school right next to their home at 220 Mott Street. 5th child and last son, Anthony, came along in 1891, the same year Carnegie Hall opened its doors. The Paterno family was expanding in pace with Manhattan. Frank and Joseph were helping their father John in the building yards, while Charles attended school. The sons sold newspapers on Sunday mornings and delivered groceries, while the eldest, Celestina, took sewing jobs to contribute to the family purse. In 1892, John and Carolina's 8th child, Rose, was born, and the construction of St. John the Divine Cathedral was started. In 1894, 9th child, Teresa, was born. The following year, Celestina married Victor Sarabone, who, like the Paternos, was from Castelmezzano, Italy. That same year, son Frank, deciding that apprenticing with his father in the building yards wasn't his calling, moved to Philadelphia. He eventually joined a traveling circus, toured the world, and landed in London. Charles, with his early academic success, was directed by his parents to pursue higher education. From their humble beginnings, the Paterno family worked together with Mama Carolina, managing the finances and stretching every dollar in order to forge a life of dignity, comfort, and achievement for her family. John Paterno moved up from foreman to general construction supervisor, all while Manhattan expanded. In Morningside Heights, the area northwest of Central Park that would become well known to the Paterno family, construction of the cathedral was underway. St. Luke's Hospital, which is now Mount Sinai Morningside, broke ground in 1896, and that same year, the Columbia University campus was relocated to Morningside Heights from Lower Manhattan. The Paterno family sensed that this area of the borough was soon to be in demand for housing, and they relocated to the area from 220 Mott Street to 930 Amsterdam Avenue between 105th and 106th Streets, just 4 blocks south of St. John the Divine. With Mama Carolina's frugal management of the multiple household incomes, John Paterno was finally able to afford his first entrepreneurial building projects on 106th Street, literally right around the corner from their new residence. 151 and 156 were designed by Frank A. Lang, and 204 was designed by M.V.B. Furden. The architect for John's very first solo project, 154, is unknown, but very likely was Frank A. Lang, based on the proximity and architectural design. The addresses in the color red throughout this presentation are coded for buildings that are now demolished. John built 505 and 507 West 112th Street, just across Amsterdam Avenue from St. John the Divine, both of which have been demolished. The lot for 505 was assumed by the expanded Home for Aged, which you can see the corner of in the photo, and 507 is depicted in the photo as an empty lot. Destiny was looking up for this hard-working immigrant family, but little did the family know what tragedy lurked just around the corner. John Paterno, while on the job site, complained to his son Joseph about his health and strength, which was mysteriously and rapidly declining. The buildings on 112th Street that we just saw were underway. Baby Christina had just been born, and Charles was completing his residency at the old Bellevue Hospital after graduating from the newly founded Cornell University Medical College. It was thought that John had terminal cancer, but he was not willing to settle for an American medical opinion. He wanted to be seen by Italian doctors, and if he were going to die soon, he wanted to do so in his native country. Carolina, the family pillar, homemaker, and mother of a newborn, was unable to travel with her husband to Italy. The 112th Street buildings were funded by family savings and absolutely had to be completed. Joseph, just 18 years old, was assigned to the job since he had been apprenticing with his father, while older brother Frank was in London and while Charles was at medical school. Joseph needed immediate help and recruited Charles, age 21, away from his medical pursuits for, quote unquote, just one project. That left eldest son Frank to be called from London to escort Papa John from New York City to Castelmezzano, where he died in late September of 1899 at the young age of 48. What breaks my heart is that the photo we have been seeing of Papa John may have been the only photograph taken of him during his lifetime. It is his passport photo, and he only needed an American passport one time in his life to get back to Italy. Imagine sitting for that photo, and then imagine saying goodbye to your wife and children. Here is a portrait of the family in mourning after Frank returned to America. In the center is that same photo of Papa John. Youngest child, Christina, seen here on Mama Carolina's lap, is 26 years younger than the eldest child, Celestina, who is standing behind her mother. Let me just say this. Hats off to you, Mama Carolina. Unbeknownst to the Paterno family, who was mired in shock and grief, fate was plotting the beginnings of an exquisite, albeit purely accidental, business model that would prove to be the robust engine behind what would become an apartment house empire. Joseph and Charles completed the apartment houses at 505 and 507 West 112th Street, which we already saw next to the Home for Aged. The entire family, minus Papa John, Frank, and Celestina, who was living with her husband Victor, swiftly moved into 507 from 930 Amsterdam Avenue. Upon the sale of 505, the brothers made a $3,000 profit, plus the lot next door was given in partial payment. So they built a third matching building at 509, named the San Marino, under the business name of John Paterno's sons, which included Charles, Joseph, and brother-in-law Victor. The sale of 509 yielded another $3,000. Frank didn't hang around in America. He returned to London to fetch his betrothed, Minnie Rose Breeden, and together they relocated to Castelmezzano with their first son. John Paterno's sons went on to build 149 West 105th Street, known as the Salome, in 1901, for which the sale yielded a whopping $40,000 in profit. Charles quickly realized that he would probably never earn money at this rate practicing medicine. He stayed with construction and never practiced medicine, yet maintained a medical license and the title of doctor his entire life. This was an unconventional yet valuable asset on building sites for his crews and their families. Next were 205 West 103rd Street, known as El Casco Court in 1902, and 148 to 152 West 104th Street, the now demolished Putnam Court in 1903. In 1904, Charles made his first visit back to Castelmezzano to pay tribute to his father's resting place and to visit his brother Frank, who reverted back to his native name of Saverio and who moved into the family home in Castelmezzano. While there, Charles met with his second cousin, Anthony Campagna, whose grandmother was one of Mama Carolina's older sisters. Anthony, a young lawyer, was encouraged to come to America to work with the Paterno brothers, which is the business name Joseph, Charles, and Victor were now using. Anthony wasn't convinced, though. After all, he had invested so much time and money and effort to become a trained lawyer at the Royal University of Naples, but the seed had been planted. Going forward, I will be showing you mostly clusters of buildings, as the Paternos tended to build that way. Blue pins on the map indicate buildings where they still stand, and red pins indicate Paterno buildings that no longer stand. Only 14 Paterno buildings have been demolished, and we have seen 5 already. I won't be able to give you too much detail about each building because there are so many to see. However, I will provide for you my website at the end of this presentation, where there is much more information on each building. This slide shows a cluster of buildings along Morningside Drive between 114th and 116th Streets, 2 blocks north of the hospital and across the street from the Columbia University campus. It was fashionable at this time to give buildings a name. These 6 brick buildings were all designed by the firm Schwartz and Gross and were sold within 6 months of their completion. Cathedral Court, number 5 on the map, is the oldest Paterno building still standing that was designed by Schwartz and Gross. The family would hire this firm to design 36 of their buildings. Graduates of the Hebrew Technical Institute, Simon Schwartz and Arthur Gross, were partners for nearly 4 decades, starting in 1903. Their partnership, which proved to be extremely successful, specialized in luxury apartment buildings and hotels. Schwartz and Gross is considered one of the architectural firms whose numerous apartment houses helped shape the face and style of the Upper East and Upper West sides of Manhattan. Note that these six-story buildings have their fire escape ladders neatly tucked into alcoves as a way to preserve the exterior aesthetic. Soon, steel would make these exterior fire escapes unnecessary, and along with the invention of elevators, would allow buildings to be built taller. Revere Hall and River Hall were built by Charles and Joseph in 1905 on 114th Street between Riverside Drive and Broadway. The Sunnycrest, now demolished, was brother-in-law Victor Sarabone's first project as principal builder in 1907, and he built Victor Hall in 1908. Revere Hall and River Hall are now owned by Columbia University. Victor Hall was purchased by Columbia University in 1965 and currently serves as the Columbia Alumni Center. The location of the Sunnycrest is now an empty lot. All 4 buildings were designed by Schwartz and Gross. Most Paterno buildings were constructed, then rented fully before being sold to investors as a no-risk investment for the buyer. Very few apartment houses remained in the ownership of the Paterno family for more than several years. Once their reputation was solidified, buildings were even sometimes purchased before construction was complete. 1905 finds the Paterno family making their early mark on Manhattan. Since 1902, Saverio has been in Castelmezzano with his British wife, Minnie, who were quickly becoming a checkpoint for Southern Italian natives eager to reach work in America. The couple taught the laborers basic English, organized essential paperwork, provided departure, travel, and arrival instructions, and orchestrated work with Paterno Brothers Construction. With Charles, Joseph, and Victor ready to receive the laborers in New York City, the Paterno Manhattan apartment house building machine roared with ferocity and expedient success. Long before President Roosevelt's 1938 labor laws, large immigrant construction crews on Paterno projects typically worked in excess of 60 hours per week, which is how their apartment houses on average were erected within a year's time. The Interborough Rapid Transit underground subway system broke ground in 1900, and the 116th Street station, one of the original 28 stations, opened in 1904 at 116th Street and Broadway. This would determine the locations of the next Paterno buildings. Charles already visited cousin Anthony Campagna in 1904 and planted the seed to come to America. Joseph would visit Castelmezzano, his brother Saverio, and Anthony Campagna in 1907. Joseph convinced Anthony to stop in New York City on his way to Chicago, where Anthony was heading to work for an Italian newspaper. In preparation, Saverio and his British wife, Minnie, taught Anthony English as they did the laborers. By the time Anthony reached the Paterno home in late 1908, the family was living at 582 West 183rd Street, and it is here where he first met Paterno's sister, Marie. It wasn't long before they fell in love and courted long distance between New York City and Chicago until they married in 1909. Second cousin Anthony not only joined the family by marriage, but he also quickly became part of Paterno Brothers Construction. Now there was a lawyer and a doctor on the team. Note the Metro subway symbol circled in red. This is the 116th Street station at Broadway that opened in 1904. Two sets of twin buildings were well positioned by Paterno Brothers to utilize this modern transportation amenity. Porter Arms, an outdoor resident club, were built in 1906 and designed by Schwartz and Gross. Both of the 10-story Beaux-Arts style apartment buildings are currently owned by Barnard College and used as student dormitories. The 12-story Broadview and the 10-story Westerfield were built in 1907 and 1908, respectively. The Broadview is a 45-unit building that is now referred to as Columbia Apartments. It serves, along with the Westerfield, the Columbia and Barnard communities. As you can see on the map, there are many more unnumbered blue pins. The Paternos would build many more buildings in the area, and we will get to them shortly. But first, Paterno Castle. This is probably the most famous Paterno building due to its shining display of wealth and audacity. The Paterno brothers, including Saverio in Italy, and brothers-in-law, formed a leadership and management team of sizable proportion to govern the steady flow of immigrant Southern Italian workers, all while Mama Carolina continued to steadfastly oversee the family financials in her traditionally prudent way. The family grew in extreme wealth in a short amount of time due to a brilliant, though accidental, transatlantic business model that proved to be a tale of immigrant success. Charles and Minnie Middaugh married in December of 1906. She was a descendant of the Walcotts, a founding family of Connecticut. Her second cousin, 4 times removed, Oliver Walcott, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Charles and Minnie broke ground on their castle in 1907, the same year as the financial panic, and moved in 1909. Just 8 years after unintentionally starting in the construction business, Dr. Charles V. Paterno was able to afford to build a castle as his primary residence. These photos are early images of the castle before the conservatory glass house extension, the addition of 7 large greenhouses, swimming pool, and the installation of a 75-foot-high retaining wall with pergola overlooking the Hudson River. Over time, Charles acquired more land to add to his estate until it spanned from 182nd Street to 186th Street along Northern Avenue, which is now called Cabrini Boulevard. The castle was quote unquote designed by John C. Watson. Very little is actually known about this architect, who designed only a handful of theaters and garages besides one impressive castle. It's suspected that Charles was the actual designer, and John was a relatively inexpensive licensed architect hired to draft and submit the drawings to the city buildings superintendent. This is how the full castle estate looked before demolition in 1938. Built in the same year of 1908, these 6 8-story buildings were all designed by Schwartz and Gross and constructed on the same block between Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue, with the first set of 3 facing 114th Street and the Columbia University campus, and the other set of 3 facing 113th Street. Santa Maria and the Arizona are still active apartment buildings. The Tennessee is now Ruggles Hall Dormitory for Columbia. The Michigan, Illinois, and Louisiana are also still active apartment houses, serving mostly the Columbia University community. The 10-story Barnard Court at 15 Claremont Avenue, building number 1, just north of 116th Street, is 4th son, 6th child, Michael Paterno's first apartment house project as principal builder. He was 21 years old at the time and had the help of his brothers and brothers-in-law, as they all did for each other, but his name headed up the building permit for the very first time. Trained well by his older brothers, Michael took to luxury quickly and worked with Schwartz and Gross for the designs. Next door is Tompkins Hall, sometimes referred to as the Sophomore. Then on the other side of the block, facing Riverside Drive, is the Paterno, Stadium View, and Shore View, all built in 1909 by Paterno Brothers and designed by Schwartz and Gross. The Paterno is probably the second best known Paterno building after the Paterno Castle, thanks to having been named after the family. It's easy to remember that the Paterno was built by the Paterno brothers. Across 116th Street, the Coliseum, though smaller, pairs with the Paterno to create an opposing curved entrance toward the Broadway side of the Columbia campus. The Coliseum is now owned by Columbia University and houses postdoctoral scholars, faculty, and staff in 32 apartments. Along the south side of 116th Street are a total of 6 Paterno buildings between Riverside Drive and Broadway. Further up Claremont Avenue from Barnard Court and Tompkins Hall is the campus, also known as DeWitt Clinton Hall, built by brother-in-law Victor Sarabone and designed by Schwartz and Gross in 1910. Facing Riverside Drive north of Stadium View and Shore View, which we just saw, are Michael Paterno's next projects, the Aqua Vista and the Monte Vista. These matching buildings were designed in 1909 by Schwartz and Gross to each host 25 apartments. Let's check in with the family. To get a sense of where they are in their lives, I've noted the age of each family member. No, Minnie Middaw's age is not a typo, and this becomes an issue shortly. Mama Carolina, as indicated by the house icon on her image, is sharing a home with several of her children. We'll see that location in a minute. Celestina, her husband Victor, Maria and Anthony Campagna, who are now married, unmarried siblings Michael, Anthony, Rose, Teresa, and Christina are all living together with Mama Carolina. Severio and Minnie are in Castelmezzano. Charles and his Minnie are living in their castle, and Joseph and his new wife, Jewel, lived at the family home for several months, and after the Colosseum was completed, they moved in. The Paternos, like many immigrant families, stuck together and lived nearby for the most part. The red circle on the upper left indicates the location of the Paterno Castle, where Charles and Minnie lived at approximately 184th Street between Riverside Drive and Northern Avenue, which will become Cabrini Boulevard. On the lower right, with the house icon, circled are two identical homes built by the family in 1909 at approximately 188th Street on Northern Avenue. Mama Carolina and her children would move here from their 582 West 183rd Street location. Later in 1921, sisters Rose and Teresa, when they are both married, will build twin homes at approximately 186th Street between Northern Avenue and Chittenden Avenue. These residences at 184th, 186th, and 188th Streets are within walking distance, keeping just about all of Mama Carolina's children nearby. Here are the twin family homes at 340 and 344 Northern Avenue, where Mama Carolina and her children lived. 340 has been demolished, but 344 still stands. The lower left photo shows 344 before its front porches were removed, and the color photo shows how the building looks today. The photo on the right shows their magnificence when they were new and basically out in the country. Each floor was spacious, and 8 of Mama Carolina's 10 children lived here with her as married people, single people, and as their offspring came along. The surviving house at 344 Cabrini Boulevard has been divided up into 8 apartments. Just when things were clicking along so well for the Paterno brothers, a fissure struck. The Paternos were a proud Catholic family who brought with them from the old world traditional ways of living. Charles fell in love with Minnie, who swept his heart away. She was a Protestant, 10 years older than he, divorced, and had a son from her first marriage. Tension arose within the family. Pressure built, and after building over 40 buildings together, Joseph and Charles chose to no longer build together. Some have even suggested that Dr. Paterno considered returning to medicine at this point in his life. Joseph retained the Paterno brothers' business name for himself, and Charles continued as the Paterno Construction Company, which he established for building his castle. They are both still Paternos and both still brothers, but together they are no longer the Paterno brothers. Joseph, with a new architect named Paterno-Cappiello, built a series of 3 buildings. In 1910, just after the split, Joseph marked the Luxor with a monogrammed cartouche of PB for Paterno brothers. Perhaps feeling a little more territorial, by 1911, he placed a JP for Joseph Paterno on both the Regnor and the Rexor. Monogram buildings become a standout feature of Aiello-designed Paterno buildings. Paterno-Cappiello was from Sicily, arriving in America in 1902 at 19 years old. Trained in Italy, he soon set himself up as an architect, with his first recorded project dating in 1906. Next, he designed a few buildings for Bernard Crystal on the Upper West Side, putting him in the neighborhood of the Paterno family. Aiello was fond of engraving his name on a cornerstone of his buildings and monogramming a cartouche with 1 initial or 2 initials of the builder. The Regnor must have held a special place in Joseph's heart, as it was his office address until 1927. And in true competitive brotherly style, in 1911, Charles built his own set of 3 buildings right after the breakup. The Mark Anthony and the Prince Humbert were designed by Schwartz and Gross, but for the Prince Monaco, Charles hired the new architect Gaetan Aiello and put about 6 Ps all over the building. While there was certainly some competition, at least at the beginning of the split, Charles and Joseph, working independently, I think, proved to be to their benefit and to the benefit of Manhattan. Rather than work on the same projects, they worked on different projects simultaneously, and both explored and developed their unique styles and concepts. Staying together may have limited their output and may have squelched their divergent creativity. Shortly after the two main brothers split up in 1912, brother-in-law Anthony Campagna struck out on his own for the first time after working with Charles and Joseph for 3 years. The Lucania at 235 West 71st Street between West End Avenue and Broadway is Anthony's first project as principal builder. This attractive building has been reworked extensively over the years, but the limestone lower 2 floors have remained largely the same. The architect was Gaetan Aiello, and while Anthony wasn't ready to place his own initials in the cartouche over the entrance, he did place there an L for Lucania. Don't worry though, he would overcome his humble shyness very soon. This 1912 apartment house at 200 West 58th Street at the corner of 7th Avenue and just south of Central Park features very prominent monogram cartouches on the 3 exposed corners of the building. This building is featured alone because it doesn't cluster with any other Paterno buildings, and it's an opportunity to showcase the renovated entranceway and lobby. The bold black doorway on 57th Street is new, and the interior is adorned with striped floors and bold black and white wallpaper. The ornate decorative molding, though, is original. It was designed by Gaetan Aiello. An old report has a letter P cartouche over the original entranceway, which we can now not see or verify due to the new modern entryway. Anthony comes back for his second building, the Luxonia, and this time he not only puts the building's initial in a cartouche over the entranceway, he also puts his own initials in a second cartouche over the 5th-story center window. This is the only Paterno building that has 2 differently monogrammed cartouches. Right away, Anthony had an eye for luxury. This building is located at 305 West 72nd Street between Riverside Drive and West End Avenue. Anthony's eye for luxury apartment houses would eventually earn him a controversial reputation, which of course we will explore as the years progress. In 1913, Joseph built 2 buildings that appear to be one, the Rexford and the Sanford, designed by Schwartz and Gross, together fill the west end of the block facing Broadway between 78th and 79th Streets. In the family, sisters Rose and Teresa are married by 1915. Joseph Faella and Ralph Chiluzzi would join the family building team. Anthony Campagna has called for his younger brothers, Michael, age 20, and Armino, age 17, to leave Castelmezzano and join him and his wife's family in the twin homes at 340 and 344 Northern Avenue. Now, here is a cluster of buildings built over 12 years on West End Avenue between 102nd and 104th Streets. Buildings 1, 2, and 5 were designed by Gaetan Aiello, and buildings 3, 4, and 6 were designed by Rosario Candela, who trained with Aiello. Note that all 6 buildings feature monogram cartouches. Building number 1, the Mentone, anchors this cluster in the timeline. It was built in 1912 by Michael Paterno. Joseph built 885 West End Avenue in 1915 and 884 across the street in 1919. Next came 878 West End Avenue, building number 6 in 1922, built by brother-in-law Ralph Chiluzzi. The following year, he built building number 3, 875 West End Avenue in 1923, and Joseph built 8 65 West End Avenue in 1924. At the intersection of West End Avenue and 103rd Street, we have a Paterno building on all four corners. Here is another cluster of buildings between 84th and 85th Streets, just off West End Avenue, built over 9 years. Building 1 and 2 anchor this cluster in the timeline and were built by Charles in 1914. While this is the first time we're seeing Brother Anthony Paterno with buildings 3, 5, and 6, these are not his first buildings. His first building was built in 1915, which we'll see in another cluster. Anthony Campagna's younger brother, Armino, who arrived in 1915, built his second building at 522 West End Avenue, building number 4, with Rosario Candela in 1923. We'll see his first building shortly in another cluster. We now know that most Aiello buildings designed for the Paternos were monogrammed. Building number 2 has an unmonogrammed cartouche. Building number 3 has an AP cartouche. Building number 5 has an obstructed monogram cartouche. Here we see a maroon awning covering half the cartouche. My best guess is that it's a P overlaid with a C. If that's the case, it's the only family building that features 2 last name initials of 2 builders. Usually it's 1 or 2 initials of 1 builder. For this building, Anthony Paterno was assisted by Victor Sarabone, and the cartouche reflects this partnership. Building number 6 doesn't have a monogram cartouche, but it does have a face. My guess is Aiello took this opportunity to place his face above the entranceway. I inserted Aiello's photo so that you can compare. What do you think? Do you think that's Aiello on 505 West End Avenue? Here are 2 outliers built by Charles. 575 West End Avenue, built in 1915, on the corner of 88th Street, does not land in a cluster. It was designed by Aiello. Building number 2 does not land in a cluster either. It was originally a garage designed by John C. Watson, the quote-unquote architect of Charles's castle. The 1916 garage has since been converted into luxury condominiums. Along and near Riverside Drive, 1 per block, are 4 Paterno buildings between 106th and 110th Streets. 360 Riverside Drive, building number 2, the Rutherford, is Anthony Paterno's first building as principal builder. It anchors this cluster in the timeline, having been built in 1915. Anthony was 24 years old when he built his first building with architect Gaetan Aiello. The building has 1 small letter P cartouche under the 12th story window. Next is building number 1, also by Aiello, 375 Riverside Drive, built by Michael Paterno. Then 300 West 108th Street, the Charlton. Building number 3 was built by Victor Sarabone and designed by Rosario Candela. It features a letter C cartouche, which represents so much for this building. Sarabone, who is assisted by Michael Campagna, designed by Candela, and named the Charlton. 315 West 106th Street was built by Joseph Paterno and also designed by Candela and marked with a P. This 106th Street building is just a couple of blocks west of Papa John Paterno's very first buildings. This cluster, hovering around West End Avenue and 75th Street, features the Van Horn, building number 1, built by Charles and designed by Schwartz and Gross in 1916, and is the building that anchors this cluster in the timeline. The other 3 were built in 1920 and 1923 by Anthony Campagna, working with architects George Pelham and Rosario Candela. 240 West 75th Street is Pelham's first building with the Paterno family. George Frederick Pelham was born in Ontario, Canada, to an architect father who moved the family and worked for New York City's Department of Public Works. George was privately tutored and opened his own architectural firm in 1890, specializing in apartment houses, hotels, row houses, and commercial buildings. He designed buildings for over 4 decades, predominantly on the Upper West Side. In 1916, Anthony Campagna built 680 West End Avenue at 93rd Street, designed by Rouse and Goldstone. This was the only family building designed by this firm. 8 years later, younger brother Armino Campagna would build 698 right next door. In 1916, Charles built 270 Park Avenue and the Marguerite Hotel, taking up the entire city block between Park and Madison Avenues, between 47th and 48th Streets. This is the 8th of 14 demolished Paterno buildings. On the pink map, the smaller side was the hotel, and the larger side was filled with apartments, both oriented around the landscaped inner courtyard and driveway. Construction was completed in the fall of 1917 at a cost of around $8 million, exclusive of the land. 12 stories tall, there were 20 acres of floor space divided into 108 apartments. Deemed the largest apartment building in the world at the time, a December 1917 advertisement counted 1,536 living rooms, 1,476 closets, and 100 kitchens. 270 Park Avenue was replaced by the Union Carbide building in 1960, and beginning in 2021, the new J.P. Morgan Chase 60-story super tall building has been under construction. Clustered around 105th Street between Riverside Drive and West End Avenue are 3 buildings by Joseph Paterno and 1 by Victor Sarabone. 905 West End Avenue, building number 1, designed by Gaetan Aiello, anchors this cluster in the timeline, having been built in 1916. Next came building number 4, 325 Riverside Drive, designed in 1920, also by Aiello. Building number 2 was designed by Rosario Candela at 915 West End Avenue in 1922. And in 1924, building number 3 at 910 West End Avenue was built and designed by George Pelham. In response to the housing shortage and demand after World War I, Anthony Campagna, Joseph Paterno, and Armino Campagna built these 5 modest 6-story apartment houses along Riverside Drive between 145th and 148th Streets in 1919 and 1920. Building number 1, 680 Riverside Drive, was Armino's first project as principal builder. In 1880, when Papa John Paterno immigrated from Castelmezzano, Manhattan's population was almost 1.2 million. By 1920, when these buildings were being erected, the population was almost 2.3 million. In just 40 years, the population nearly doubled. This cluster takes us back to 71st Street, where Anthony Campagna built his first building, the Lucania, in 1912, which is denoted as an L on the map. Brothers-in-law Ralph Chiluzzi and Joseph Faella built on West End Avenue with Rosario Candela as architect. Brothers Anthony and Joseph Paterno built with architect Gaetan Aiello on West 71st Street. Anthony's building number 3 anchors this cluster in the timeline, having been built in 1919. The following year, 1920, came building number 4 by Joseph Paterno. Joseph Faella, Rose Paterno's husband, built building number 2 in 1923, and Ralph Chiluzzi, Teresa Paterno's husband, built building number 4 in 1927. Meanwhile, Anthony Campagna has jumped up to 820 Riverside Drive north of 158th Street to build the Marion Garden Apartments in a Tudor Revival style designed by George F. Pelham in 1921. This style was popular following the First World War. The center of the uniquely shaped building was designed for a nearly 4,000 square foot Italian garden, affording each apartment a view, sunshine, and fresh air. The courtyard walls are adorned with terracotta panels of knights and shields. Catching up with the family in 1920, Joseph and Jewel Paterno purchased a mansion in Riverdale in the Bronx and named it Villa Paterno. Michael Paterno has returned from serving with the Engineers Corps on the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I. Anthony Paterno has married Dorothy Schaefer, and youngest Paterno sibling, Christina, is engaged to Armino Campagna, Anthony's younger brother, who has been living in the family home for 5 years. In 1921, Joseph Paterno builds his own Tudor Revival apartment complex with George F. Pelham at 610 West 163rd Street between Fort Washington Avenue and Broadway in 1921. It too features an inner courtyard garden and English motif terracotta panels like Anthony Campagna's Marion Garden Apartments. Building number 2 is by Michael Campagna, and it's a bit of an enigma. Built nowhere near anything else by the family on 169th Street between Broadway and Audubon Avenue, Michael helped build another very similar building with a painting contractor to house his painting crews on 139th Street, both with the same architect, Rosario Candela. I'm suspecting this modest building may have had similar origins. Andrea Agnabeni and his crews painted the interiors of many Paterno buildings. This cluster is situated around another cluster already featured. That's why you'll see unnumbered blue pins on the map. This slide well illustrates the overlap between brothers, brothers-in-law, and architects. In a span of 4 years, we have 5 family members working with 4 different architects between Riverside Drive and West End Avenue and 89th and 83rd Streets. Anchoring the cluster in the timeline is building number 2 by Victor Sarabone at 320 West 89th Street, designed by Pelham in 1921. Next, in 1923, are building number 5 by Joseph Paterno and Rosario Candela at 332 West 86th Street, and building number 6 by Anthony Paterno and Gaetan Aiello at 473 West End Avenue. The remaining 3 come in 1925, building number 1 by Anthony Campagna and architect James E.R. Carpenter at 173 to 175 Riverside Drive, building number 3 at 607 West End Avenue by Ralph Chaluzzi and Rosario Candela, and building number 4 at 325 West 86th Street by Joseph Paterno and Rosario Candela. We saw many slides ago a map showing the proximity of the Paterno Castle and the twin family homes. Additionally, on that map was another set of twin homes built by sisters Teresa and Rose Paterno and their husbands at the corner of 186th Street and Chittenden Avenue in 1921. 9 Chittenden Avenue, which is the corner home, is photographed on the top left. Below, you can see an old photo taken from the Paterno Castle gate of 9 Chittenden Avenue in the middle of 3 buildings. The building on the left is the Pumpkin House, which is still standing and is often misattributed to Charles Paterno. The building on the right is a Paterno apartment house that will come along in 1928. On the lower right of the screen is a photo of both homes side by side. They are very similar in style, but were designed by different architects. Both of these houses, unfortunately, have been demolished. Although we have been already seeing his name, building number 1, the Clayton, is the very first Paterno building designed by Rosario Candela and Candela's very first project in Manhattan. This building anchors this cluster in the timeline, having been built in 1922. Rosario Candela was a Sicilian-American architect who emigrated to New York City around 1912 when he was 22 years old. He graduated from the Columbia University School of Architecture in 1915. After graduation, he apprenticed with Gaetan Aiello and went into private practice in 1920. Candela, over time, earned the reputation of a premier designer of luxury apartment houses for some of the most desirable addresses in the city. Building number 2 came along in 1928 by Anthony Paterno and Rosario Candela at 175 West 93rd Street, and building number 3 by brother-in-law Ralph Chaluzzi at 127 West 96th Street, and is the only Paterno project designed by the firm of Boak and Paris. It was built in 1929. 425 Riverside Drive at the corner of 115th Street was built by Joseph Paterno in 1924, designed by Rosario Candela. The large undulating building, which you can see on the pink map marked with a white dot, is interesting in how it cooperates with the apartment house next door to mutually create inner courtyards for the benefit of light and air. 114 West 70th Street was built by Joseph Faella in 1922. It was the only Paterno building designed by the firm of Sommerfeld and Steckler. This building is the southernmost Paterno building on the west side, as you can see on the map. At this point in the presentation, let's assess what we've seen and what's to come. Everything we've seen so far, represented by blue and red pins on the map, has been on the west side of Central Park. The yellow numbers indicate what we have seen. We have seen 101 apartment houses, all 4 family homes, 1 castle, 1 garage, now condo. While the Paterno story is indeed a tale of being in the right place at the right time, with New York City's booming population demanding new apartment houses, the entirety of their success wasn't due to luck alone. They were undoubtedly hardworking and determined people. No one can build 89 buildings in 26 years without working hard, which is exactly what the family accomplished by the end of 1922. We have 54 apartment houses left to see, which will go pretty quickly, as 20 of those buildings are part of just 2 complexes, plus 1 theater, 1 cultural center, and 1 tiny steel house. Building number 1 by Michael Paterno and Rosario Candela at 1105 Park Avenue at the corner of 89th Street is the first Paterno building to be constructed on the east side of Central Park. It's also Candela's first ever east side project. This 1922 building anchors this cluster in the timeline. It may also have been the first building ever on the east side to offer penthouse living. 4 blocks south at 85th Street, Anthony Campagna built 1021 Park Avenue in 1929, designed also by Candela. It appears to just be a three window wide, narrow building, but it's an L-shaped building dictated by the lot constrictions imposed by the original owner of the 4-story residence next door. You can see the shape of the building on the pink map marked with a white dot. Younger brother Armino Campagna built nearby in 1953. 11 East 87th Street was designed by Tito Di Vincenzo. Charles was busy along Riverside Drive in 1923 and 1925 with George F. Pelham and Candela with these 2 buildings, which is surprising considering that at the same time, he was very involved in the construction of Hudson View Gardens, a 15-building co-op complex in 1923. Building upon Anthony Campagna's and Joseph Paterno's Tudor Revival-style projects with architect George F. Pelham, Charles created 9 6-story elevator apartments and 6 4-story walk-ups between 183rd and 186th Streets on Pinehurst Avenue. There are a total of 354 apartments. The apartments occupy just 40% of the land, and 60% is reserved for common areas. The concept was to have an apartment in the city with the atmosphere and space of a country village. When Hudson View Gardens was built, the Paterno Castle was still standing, which you can see in the illustration on the lower left. Hudson View Gardens had many features to create a sense of community, including its own baseball team. Dr. Charles V. Paterno can be seen standing in the middle of the players. Brothers Anthony and Michael Paterno both excelled at luxury. Along and near Fifth Avenue between 83rd and 85th Streets, within walking distance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, stand these three buildings. Building number 3 anchors this cluster in the timeline. 1020 Fifth Avenue features 14 floors and only 13 units, averaging in size of 5,500 square feet each. This was the only other Warren and Wetmore design for the Paterno family, in addition to 270 Park Avenue and the Hotel Marguerite. The same year, Anthony Paterno built building number 2, 10 East 85th Street, designed by George Pelham. Building number 1, 1040 Fifth Avenue, at 18 stories, is one of the tallest on the avenue and has one of the most distinctive roof lines, a signature of Rosario Candela. Built in 1929, it has only 27 apartments and is well known for having been the residence of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis for 30 years. Returning to the west side, we see buildings 1, 2, and 3 designed by Rosario Candela for Anthony Paterno and Joseph Faella in 1924 and 1925 along West End Avenue. Building number 4 at 230 Riverside Drive was designed by Charles Lynch for Ralph Chiluzzi 5 years later in 1930. The Wellston, built by Anthony Paterno and designed by Rosario Candela in 1924, is a unique building in that it appears to be 2 buildings, but functions as one. Part of it is on the corner of Amsterdam Avenue and 75th Street, and the other part is on 76th Street, about 60 feet east of Amsterdam Avenue, both somewhat wrapping around the Riverside Memorial Chapel. The 2 distinct sections are connected by a functioning passageway that you can see circled in red on the pink map. Back to the east side, here we have 4 luxury cooperative apartment buildings designed by James E.R. Carpenter and Rosario Candela, who some consider rival architects. Building number 3 at 1120 Fifth Avenue was the first Paterno family project with Carpenter. Built in 1924, it has 14 stories and was designed to house 42 large apartments. James E.R. Carpenter was a leading architect of luxury residential high-rise buildings in New York City in the early 1900s. He graduated from MIT in 1884 and then studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. In 1925, Carpenter designed again for Anthony Campagna, building number 4 at 1115 Fifth Avenue. This building replaced the well-known Jacob Rupert Mansion. Make note of Anthony's mansion demolition, because we'll talk more about that soon. The same year, building number 2 at 1172 Park Avenue was designed by Candela for Michael Paterno. This apartment house was designed with units containing 11 rooms and 4 baths, or 12 rooms and 5 baths. 4 years later, building number 1 at 1220 Park Avenue was designed by Candela for Joseph Paterno to contain 10-room duplexes. Here is a typical 1924 newspaper page with apartment advertisements. We can see 8 Paterno family buildings being advertised simultaneously in the red outlined squares. The work of 7 family builders and 4 different architects are represented here. In 1925, Mama Carolina died at her home at 344 Northern Avenue at the age of 71. 3 years later, Papa John's ashes were transported from Castelmezzano to be interred with Carolina at Woodlawn Cemetery. Ownership of the Castelmezzano family home would be deeded from Carolina to Saverio, who improved, expanded, and preserved it. The house remained in the family through Saverio's descendants until 1995 and still stands today. Celestina and Victor's daughter, Carolina, is now married to her second cousin, Michael Campagna, who is Anthony and Armino's brother, who lived in the twin family homes. The newspaper wedding announcement listed good friend Gaetan Aiello as having attended the reception. Saverio has now been elected Podesta, or Chief Magistrate of Castelmezzano, after serving in the Italian army during World War I. He would be Podesta for 20 years. Michael Paterno has married Anna Herdicla, and second cousins Christina and Armino have married. The Paterno and Campagna families are inextricably intertwined biologically, by marriage, and professionally. In 1926, Joseph and Michael Paterno and Anthony Campagna donated the construction of a cultural center called Casa Italiana to Columbia University. It was designed by McKim, Mead & White, the firm that designed the university campus. Dr. Charles Paterno donated 20,000 leather-bound Italian books for the Casa Library. In the newspaper article at the top right, you can see Michael with an M, Charles with a C, and Joseph with a J being honored. The 23-story cooperative high-rise apartment house at 825 Fifth Avenue, near the corner of 64th Street, was the fourth family project with architect James E.R. Carpenter in 1926. It is the second tallest building in the Paterno catalog and was able to achieve this height because Joseph Paterno listed this project to be an apartment hotel, allowing it to exceed the then 15-story height limit for apartment houses. Although I am completely biased toward my great-grandfather Charles's buildings, this one is my favorite Paterno building because of its distinguished height and appearance on famed Fifth Avenue, but also because Christopher Gray of New York Times Streetscapes column fame described it as, quote unquote, a tall redhead with an elegant body. By the way, Christopher Gray lived in a Paterno building for 30 years, not this one, but 1105 Park Avenue, the first Paterno building on the east side, which we've already seen. Also in 1926, working with Rosario Candela, Michael Paterno built the 13-story 775 Park Avenue on the entire west end of the block between 72nd and 73rd Streets. It was designed for 47 luxury apartments ranging from 9 to 16 rooms. 4 of the 5 roof garden penthouses were duplexes, meaning 2 stories, and the 5th penthouse was a 16-room triplex with its own elevator. Architect Rosario Candela was busy with Michael Paterno and Anthony Campagna in 1927 when they built 2 East 67th Street at Fifth Avenue and 2 East 70th Street at Fifth Avenue, buildings number 2 and 3. As New York's wealthy elite became accepting and then desiring of mansions in the sky instead of standalone ground-level mansions, buildings like 2 East 67th Street with only 15 luxury apartments were in demand. Anthony Campagna was slowly earning himself the nickname Destroyer of Mansions when he tore down the only 12-year-old Blair Mansion to build 2 East 70th Street. But Anthony was also described by others as, quote, the true lord of good taste and building elegance, artist and master of the most exquisite architectural form, unquote. So opinions clearly differed. 7 years later, Anthony built the 14-story Candela-designed 834 Fifth Avenue, just across 64th Street from that quote-unquote tall redhead with an elegant body that we just saw. The New York Observer dubbed 834 Fifth Avenue as, quote, the most pedigreed building on the snobbiest street in the country's most real estate obsessed city, unquote. It is stunning from head to toe. Anthony may have accrued a controversial nickname, but he also knew how to create an absolutely gorgeous building. 13 blocks north of that last building, Anthony Campagna next built building number 2 at 960 Fifth Avenue at 77th Street. For this high-rise co-op, Anthony tore down the 19-year-old 130-room Clark Mansion. Brothers Anthony, Michael, and Armino can be seen in the newspaper clipping admiring Senator Clark's carved marble fireplace. The new building was designed for units of 14 to 17 rooms each, not including the 8 maids' rooms, and is one of the few Manhattan co-ops with its own in-house restaurant. The famous 20-room Satterwhite apartment was located here at 960 Fifth Avenue. Building number 1 was built 10 years later by Campagna and Candela at 955 Fifth Avenue, just on the other side of 77th Street at a smaller scale with units featuring a relatively modest 7 rooms each. Many years later, in 1964, Anthony built the much taller 27-story building, number 3, at 980 Fifth Avenue at the corner of 79th Street after tearing down the 1887 Brokaw Mansion. Coming on the heels of the destruction of the beloved old Penn Station, plans to demolish the mansion caused public outrage and helped spark the creation of New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission. Containing just 45 apartment homes, despite its originating controversy, it is considered by many to be one of the finest post-war buildings on Fifth Avenue. It was designed by Resnick and Green and would be Anthony's last building in Manhattan. The destroyer of mansions, also known as the true lord of good taste, would soon reach the end of his earthly journey. In 1927, Rosario Candela designed for Anthony Paterno and Joseph Paterno 25 and 30 Sutton Place, across the street from each other on 58th Street, very near the Queensboro Bridge, crossing the East River. Both are 14 stories tall. Built behind the Chittenden twin homes of Rose and Teresa Paterno, Ralph Chiluzzi built 220 Northern Avenue, which would become Cabrini Boulevard. The 6-story building overlooking the Hudson River was designed by George F. Pelham. This is the one that we could see many slides back in the old photo of the Pumpkin House and the private home at 9 Chittenden Avenue, taken from the Paterno Castle Gate. Zipping back over to the East River, 1 Gracie Square was built in 1928 by Anthony Paterno and designed by Rosario Candela. The 15-story apartment house was home to young Jacqueline Bouvier. As Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, she would live at another one of Anthony Paterno's buildings at 1040 Fifth Avenue, which was built in 1929 that we've already seen. With the advent of the Great Depression, apartment house development grinded to a halt. In 1935, Rosario Candela designed an Art Deco 750-seat theater in Times Square for Anthony Campagna. This Rialto replaced the former Rialto developed by Paramount Pictures. The new theater was the location for the filming of the 1950s Howdy Doody show and also housed a TV studio which was used by talk show hosts Geraldo Rivera and Montel Williams. It was demolished in 1998 to make way for the 30-story Reuters building that stands there today. Another artifact of the Great Depression is this little gem. Stemming from a deed restriction on the corner lot, Dr. Paterno had to build a single-family residence on the corner of 107th Street before he could develop the set of 5 lots, all of which he owned, for an apartment house at 345 Riverside Drive. This tiny steel prefabricated house was designed by William Van Allen, who was the architect of the Chrysler Building. The tiny house stood in place for 5 years, and the lots were sold after Dr. Paterno's death. Why did he not get around to building an apartment house here, you might wonder? Probably because he was very busy building this substantial project. Jumping 10 years forward since the last Paterno apartment house was built, the hiatus due to the Great Depression, in 1938, Dr. Charles V. Paterno demolished his residential castle to make way for 5 13-story ex-plan apartment towers overlooking the Hudson River. Housing a total of 580 apartments, the complex was designed by George Pelham Jr., son of the architect who had already designed so many buildings for the Paterno family, including the Hudson View Gardens complex across the street. Also in 1938, Northern Avenue was paved and renamed Cabrini Boulevard. The structures occupy only a fifth of the property, allowing for gardens and public spaces designed by Robert Cridland, who was the landscape designer 15 years earlier for Hudson View Gardens. Several remnants of the Paterno Castle still exist on the grounds of Castle Village, including 2 garages that are now apartments, iron gate and stone pillars, retaining wall, and reconfigured stone from the castle porte cochere, making the pedestrian entry into the new parking garage. This was the first large multi-car garage to be built in Manhattan as part of an apartment complex. Castle Village, for the first time, offered Manhattan apartment dwellers a parking garage on the premises. This would be Charles's last building development before his death. 2 years later, George Pelham Jr. designed for Anthony Campagna the 19-story 530 Park Avenue Co-op at the corner of 61st Street. And in 1948, Rosario Candela designed for Anthony 135 East 54th Street at Lexington Avenue. This would be Candela's last project for the Paterno family, as he would die 5 years later. The building, now known as Lex 54, has 145 apartments and was converted from a rental in 1985. Eldest Paterno sibling Celestina died in 1939. Victor, Carolina, and Michael would make their way to the Bronx. Charles and Minnie, no longer in their castle, resided in Westchester County at their Windmill Farm estate and in their Greenwich, Connecticut home named Round Hill. Joseph Paterno died 4 months after his sister Celestina in 1939. The business name Paterno Brothers was inherited by younger brother Anthony. Jewel remained in the Bronx. Marie and Anthony Campagna migrated to the Bronx to their now landmarked Riverdale estate. Oh, the irony, considering Anthony helped give rise to that New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Michael and Anthony and their wives headed into Westchester County to build and establish grand estates. After Joseph Failla died in 1939, Rose moved into Paterno-built 425 Riverside Drive. Teresa and Ralph Chiluzzi divorced in 1934. Teresa remarried and moved to New Jersey in 1935, and Ralph died in Italy in 1939. Christina and Armino built a large house in Fieldston in the Bronx. The last 2 buildings to see in the Paterno catalog were built by Anthony Campagna and designed by Sylvan Bien in 1954 and 1955. 35 Park Avenue at the corner of 36th Street stands 19 stories tall and houses 145 apartments. 176 East 77th Street at 3rd Avenue stands at 17 stories tall and houses 165 apartments. 980 Fifth Avenue, which we've already seen, the one that gave rise to New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission, was the last Paterno family building developed in 1964. And then there were few. By 1955, all but 4 siblings had passed away. The dates in yellow indicate the year of passing of surviving family members. Minnie Breed and Paterno would come to the United States after Saverio died. Jewel moved into the Paterno-built 1220 Park Avenue. Everyone else stayed put until their last days. Paterno Brothers Construction Company expired with Anthony Paterno in 1959. It was a good run for this family. Let's look at their collective achievements in numbers. The Paterno brothers and brothers-in-law collaborated on most projects, with at least 2 or 3 of them being officers of the corporation, filing the building permit. Though as principal builder or president of the corporation, the statistics are thus. But remember, 2 of Charles's developments totaled 20 buildings. If they were counted just as 2, he would have built 40. It's safe to say that the Paterno family members were among the most prolific of the developer families of apartment buildings prior to the Second World War. And since buildings are often credited to their architects instead of their builders, let's look at those numbers too. No surprise that Rosario Candela is at the top with 40 buildings designed for the family, Schwartz and Gross 36, George Pelham Sr. 29, and Gaetan Aiello 22. Those were clearly their favorites. And here's one last way to look at the buildings by year. The 20s certainly roared, which means that many Paterno buildings are celebrating their 100-year anniversaries this decade. Thank you so much for being here with me for this video. I hope this presentation was informative and entertaining for you. It has been my honor as a Paterno descendant to discover my family's story, to realize that the Paterno buildings are just as much a part of our family tree as the people, and to share with you one immigrant family's serendipitous achievement of the American dream. Had the accidental building collapse in Castelmezzano never sent Papa John to America, and had his premature death not circumstantially forced his sons Joseph and Charles into the building trade, chances are slim that the Paterno family, through 164 buildings, would have ever had any lasting impact on one of the greatest cities in the world. PaternoArchitecture.com is my website where you can find more information about all 164 buildings in a variety of formats, such as a chronological list, as a dynamic spreadsheet, and pinned on a Google map. Every building has its own page featuring maps, photos, notes, floor plans, and newspaper articles. On my website, there is also a contact form which you can use to contact me anytime. Until then, I bid you ciao.